The quilt lay folded on the edge of her bed, each stitch trembling as if it carried a voice. My daughter's whisper came through it, soft, urgent, and impossible to ignore. What she was trying to tell me felt like a secret buried long before I was born. In a quiet, weathered farmhouse at the edge of a frost-kissed field, a single mother and her 12-year-old daughter live a life shaped by routine and quiet shadows. Their days are filled with simple chores, fading photographs, and the hum of the old wood stove. But beneath the calm, there is an undercurrent of mystery. A series of strange patterns in the quilt her daughter has been quietly stitching for months. Each shred seems to carry a memory, a question, a secret, one that might unravel a hidden year of their family history. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the windows and made the shadows feel alive. I padded down the hallway, barefoot, the wooden floor cool beneath my feet. The bedroom door was cracked open, light spilling out in a thin, golden strip. Mara sat on the floor, the quilt spread across her knees, her small hands moving with an unusual care, threading the needle in and out like she was coaxing a secret from the fabric itself. I paused, watching. The clock ticked somewhere far away, steady and patient. Her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth as she concentrated. Eyes narrowed, oblivious to me. The quilt seemed ordinary at first, soft, worn squares stitched together like all the others, but then I noticed shapes, letters, numbers, something like symbols. My chest tightened in ways I didn't expect. I cleared my throat. She didn't look at me. "Mara," I said softly, "what are you doing?" She tilted her head, a half smile brushing her lips. Her hands didn't stop moving. "It wants to speak," she whispered, almost too low to hear. I stepped closer, leaning over the edge of her little chair. "Speak," she nodded, her fingers tugging at a thread that gleamed faintly in the lamplight. "The quilt, it knows things," she said, voice trembling just slightly. I wanted to ask more, to press, but the room felt fragile, as if any noise might break the spell. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the dance of her hands, the stitches twisted into something familiar and something strange all at once. I thought I saw a small house, a tree, maybe even a clock frozen at a strange hour. My stomach churned with unease, a quiet fear that the house itself seemed to echo. How could a quilt hold something like this? I left her there, turning the doorknob slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile concentration. In my room, I lay awake, listening to the faint scratch of needle against fabric drifting through the thin walls. My mind ran over images, letters, numbers, symbols, trying to understand the story she was pulling out of the night. The wind brushed against the windows, carrying the faint scent of winter and wood smoke. Shadows moved across the walls in slow, quiet waves. I could hear the quilt whispering in my mind, the rhythm of stitches pulling me into a story I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. What story could a quilt tell that words could not? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the unseen narrative pressing against me. My chest was tight, full of questions I could not yet name. The house exhaled slowly, settling into its own quiet, leaving me with the faint, persistent pulse of stitched secrets. I thought of Mara, her small hand still moving in the lamplight, and I wondered, who else had spoken through fabric before us? And what would it tell me tomorrow? The night felt longer than it was. I lay there, listening to the silence, to the quilt, to the unspoken words between us. Somewhere in the darkness, the thread kept moving, pulling me into a story stitched carefully, one quiet loop at a time. The morning sun came in slow and golden, spilling across the floorboards in thin, trembling lines. Dust motes floated in the beams like tiny ghosts, drifting over the quilt lying across Mara's lap. I leaned against the doorway, coffee cup warm in my hands, and watched. The light caught the patchwork, and suddenly the ordinary squares seemed to hum with quiet intention. A small house appeared in neat stitches, a tree, its branches curling like fingers, and a clock frozen at midnight, its hands rigid, impossibly still. My breath caught. These weren't random patterns, not by chance. Mara hummed softly, as though Her quiet song was coaxing something out of the fabric. I asked her about it, careful to keep my voice low, almost a whisper. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the quilt, and she only pointed to certain symbols with small, urgent gestures. The rhythm of her hands was steady, insistent, like a heartbeat I could feel from across the room. The house felt heavier somehow. The walls pressed closer. Shadows from the window stretched long across the floor, and the quiet wasn't silence anymore, it was full, intimate, almost listening. I took a step closer, drawn toward the quilt as though it held the pulse of something alive, something waiting. My fingers itched to trace the stitches, to understand the secret they carried. Mara's small hand lifted, brushing a piece of the fabric against her chest. "It's telling me," she said, voice thin, almost reverent. She didn't add more. She couldn't, or she wouldn't. And that silence between us carried more weight than any explanation could. My chest tightened, my mind racing. Could this be a message from the past? From someone I had forgotten? Or from a time I never knew existed? I moved to sit on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the quilt. The warmth of the sun was fading, leaving the colors deeper, darker, almost alive in the morning light. I traced the lines in my mind, memorizing the shapes, the tiny precise stitches, and wondered how a child could carry such careful knowledge without knowing it herself. Mara finally looked up, her gaze soft but serious. "It wants you to see," she whispered. I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. My eyes went back to the quilt, the house, the tree, the clock. It was more than a story stitched in fabric. It was a question, a thread pulled through time, an invitation to follow where it led. I stayed there in silence, listening to the small creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of the quilt, the distant hum of the morning wind through the old windows. The air felt alive, charged with something unspoken, something waiting to be understood. I felt myself drawn closer, as if the quilt was breathing beneath my fingertips, whispering stories I hadn't yet learned how to hear, and in that quiet, the question lingered. Who stitched these shapes? And what were they trying to tell me? The sunlight shifted, shadows stretched longer across the floor, and I realized fully that the house wasn't empty. It was waiting for us to listen. The house felt different that day. The walls seemed to hum, low and steady, like a heartbeat I hadn't noticed before. I walked slowly from room to room, the floorboards groaning under each step, and I could almost hear the quilt's whispers trailing behind me. Mara sat by the window, the quilt spread across her lap, her hands moving with care that made my chest ache. Outside, the wind pushed against the old shutters, rattling them gently. Sunlight and shadow wove together across the wooden floor, and I could see the dust swirl, tiny dancers caught in invisible currents. Mara didn't look at me when I entered the room. She only tilted her head and nodded toward a section of the quilt. Her silence said more than words could. I studied the stitches, tracing the outlines with my eyes. Small symbols, shapes that felt familiar and yet not quite right. A house, a tree, a clock. Tiny, precise letters I couldn't read but felt in my chest, like they had been waiting for me. I asked her what they meant. She only shook her head slightly, almost apologetic, almost afraid. The air felt heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, floorboard creaked like it remembered someone long gone. I imagined the voices of the past, faint and broken, slipping through the cracks in the walls, brushing my ears with questions I didn't know how to answer. Mara hummed softly, her melody threading into the quiet, tying the room together in fragile harmony. I tried to speak again, but the words caught in my throat. The quilt seemed alive, shifting in meaning with every glance. My hands itched to touch it, to trace the hidden stories stitched into the fabric, but I held back, afraid of breaking the spell. Night fell slowly, and the shadows grew long and watchful. The wind carried the smell of damp earth through the open window, and I lay awake that evening, listening to the faint scratching of Mara's needle, imagining all the voices stitched into the quilt. What year, what secret, could a child's hands carry in silence? I realized the quilt was more than cloth. It was a bridge, A whisper, a memory made tangible, pulling me into a past I didn't fully know yet. And somewhere deep down, I understood. The quiet was not empty. It was full of echoes waiting to speak. The attic smelled of dust and old wood. I climbed the narrow steps slowly, each creak a reminder of the years layered over this house. Boxes and trunks leaned against one another like tired bodies, their surfaces coated in thick gray dust. Sunlight sifted in through a small window, painting the room in thin stripes of gold. I opened the first box and found nothing but yellowed papers, brittle photographs, and a diary with a cracked spine. The smell of old paper was sharp, almost bitter, and it filled my lungs with memory I didn't recognize. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the pages, discovering fragments of a year long forgotten. Each line, each word, seemed stitched with care into a story that had been buried on purpose. Mara followed quietly behind me, her small hand brushing against the boxes as if she were reading them with her fingertips. She didn't speak. She never had to. The quilt had already told her. And now, we were sifting through the remnants, chasing the same invisible thread. Among the papers, I found an old calendar, a year circled in faded ink. No notes, no explanation, just a silent marking. A place where someone had stopped counting, stopped remembering. My chest tightened. Could this be the same year Mara's quilt was trying to show me? I traced a circle with my finger, imagining the hands of a clock frozen at midnight, like the one stitched into the quilt. The attic was silent except for the faint rustle of paper, and the house felt alive in its quiet. Shadows pulled in corners, and I imagined them holding stories too, heavy to speak. Mara knelt beside me, her small shoulders hunched, pointing to a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize at first. And then I did. My aunt, the one everyone had forgotten, the one who had disappeared when I was too young to understand. The weight of the forgotten year pressed down on me. Every memory the house had swallowed, every silence that had been enforced, was now pressing against our fingers, the quilt, the papers. The air felt almost sacred. My heart ached with questions that couldn't be spoken aloud. Mara's small hand rested on mine, steady, grounding. She didn't need to explain. The quilt had led us here. The pieces were beginning to fit, and I understood, in the hush of the attic, that some stories waited decades to be told, hidden not in words, but in corners, in fabric, in the spaces between. The sunlight shifted and slanted through the window, catching dust in midair, turning it into golden sparks. The evening light had already begun to fade when I noticed Mara's hands trembling over the quilt. She was sitting on the floor, legs folded beneath her, the fabric draped across her knees like a fragile shield. Her movements were careful, almost desperate, as if she were stitching faster to outrun something only she could feel. I leaned against the doorway, silent, listening to the soft whisper of the needle-piercing cloth. The air felt heavier than it had in days. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, stretching long and thin over the floorboards. The faint creak of the old house sounded louder somehow, like it was holding its breath. I could smell the faint tang of wool and thread, mixed with the lingering scent of winter from the cracked window. My chest tightened. Something about the quilt had changed. I knelt beside her. "Mara," I said softly, my voice almost swallowed by the quiet. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, they were fixed on the fabric, flicking over patterns I could barely decipher. The stitches now formed shapes that made my stomach churn. A figure, small and alone, a shadow of a person I recognized only from fading photographs. My aunt. She had disappeared when I was a child, swallowed by a year we never spoke of. Mara's small shoulders shook, though I wasn't sure if it was from cold or fear. "It's her," she whispered, voice barely audible. "It wants me to show you." She tugged the quilt closer to her chest, hiding the shape for a moment, then revealed it again, careful and precise, as though afraid of what would happen if she were too quick. I swallowed. The room suddenly too tight, too close. The quiet pressed against me, full of whispers I couldn't hear and questions I couldn't answer. "Why now?" I asked. My voice trembled, though softly. Mara only shook her head. She didn't need words. The quilt was speaking. Her hands were the translator. I reached out, almost touching the fabric, almost daring to trace the figure with my fingers. The warmth of her small hand brushed mine, grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of panic. She looked at me then, just for a moment, her eyes wide, fearful yet certain. I nodded, even though I didn't understand fully, even though my heart raced with dread. The room seemed to hold its own breath. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches, tapping gently against the window panes. Shadows moved across the walls, and the quilt trembled slightly under Mara's hands, as if it carried more than thread, more than memory. Something unseen had pressed itself into our home. And for the first time, I understood the quilt was not just a story, it was a warning, a revelation, a thread reaching from the past into our present. Night fell completely, swallowing the last traces of sunlight. Mara finally rested, her hands folding the quilt into her lap, small and steady again. I sat beside her, trying to breathe in rhythm with her quiet, trying to let the fear settle, even if only slightly. The house remained silent but full, alive with secrets we had only begun to glimpse. I realized then, in the stillness, that the quilt would not let us rest until we followed it further. Some stories were stitched with fear, and some truths demanded we feel that fear fully before we could understand. And somewhere beneath the threads, beneath the quiet tremor of her small hands, I knew we were only just beginning. The wind pressed against the windows that morning, carrying the faint scent of frost and old leaves. I found Mara sitting at the edge of her bed, the quilt draped across her knees like a small, sacred altar. The light from the rising sun slanted through the blinds, catching the stitches and turning the threads into tiny shafts of gold. She hummed softly, a quiet rhythm that seemed to pull the shadows closer. I leaned against the doorway, hesitant. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, and the house felt almost aware, listening. Mara's hands moved carefully, tracing patterns I couldn't yet comprehend. The quilt no longer seemed like cloth and thread. It felt alive, pulsing with a memory I had not been invited to see, yet here I was, drawn in any way. She finally looked at me, eyes serious, almost solemn. "It's the year no one remembers," she whispered, voice small but certain. My throat went dry. I wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but I didn't. I could feel the quilt guiding her words, shaping her understanding in ways I could only sense. The small symbols and shapes stitched across the fabric now made sense in fragments. The frozen clock, the small house, the lone tree. Each was a marker, a memory, a fragment of a year erased. I sat beside her, careful not to disturb the quiet, tracing the faint lines of stitches in my mind. "Whose year?" I asked softly, barely above a whisper. Mara tilted her head, the hint of a smile touching her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Someone we lost. Someone who was hidden. Someone forgotten," she said. She didn't explain more. She didn't have to. The quilt spoke for her. The room seemed to stretch, holding the sound of our quiet voices, the soft scrape of thread against fabric, the gentle creak of floorboards. Outside, the wind rustled the bare trees, their branches tapping lightly against the window. I felt a strange mixture of awe and fear, the way a story can settle in your chest before it fully reveals itself. The year she spoke of was not just a time on a calendar. It was a life, a presence, stitched carefully into cloth so it could be remembered. I reached out, almost touching the quilt, but stopped. Her small hand hovered over mine, steady and reassuring. She was guiding me, showing me the rhythm of the story without words. I felt the weight of that hidden year, pressing into me, shaping me, pulling me toward a truth that had been buried too long. We sat there for a long time, the sun inching higher, and I realized the quilt was more than a story. It was a bridge, a channel through which the past could speak to the present. Every stitch, every careful line, carried a fragment of someone's life, a whisper of a year erased. I could almost hear the voices now, faint and broken, brushing against my ears with questions that demanded attention. The light shifted across the room, falling in soft, trembling patterns. Mara leaned back, the quilt folding neatly into her lap, and I understood. Some truths cannot be spoken aloud. They must be seen, felt, traced, stitch by stitch, through the careful hands of a child who remembers more than we do. And somewhere, beneath the quiet rhythm of thread, I knew we were standing at the threshold of a revelation that would change everything. The town archives smelled of paper and dust, a faint tang that reminded me of old letters tucked in trunks long forgotten. The morning light streamed through tall windows, cutting golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. Mara's small hand found mine, and together we stepped carefully between rows of filing cabinets, each one holding fragments of lives that had been folded, pressed, and stored away. I ran my fingers along the spines of ledgers, feeling the roughness of old leather, the faint indentation of names and dates long erased. The quiet was dense here, heavy with the weight of things people had chosen not to remember. Somewhere, a hinge squeaked, a reminder that the building itself was alive, listening to the stories being sifted through its bones. Mara didn't speak. She didn't need to. The quilt's memory guided her, invisible lines leading her forward, threading the past into our present. I opened the ledger, the pages brittle beneath my fingers, and found a photograph tucked inside. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but the face was unmistakable. My aunt. My chest tightened as I traced her features with my eyes. A young girl frozen in time. Her story had been hidden, erased from conversation, tucked away like the fragile papers around us. The quilt had known her before I did. Mara tugged me toward a small shelf where a collection of faded newspaper clippings had been left. My fingers shook slightly as I unfolded one. A winter festival, a missing child, a name carefully avoided in family conversations. The words on the page aligned with the shapes stitched into Mara's quilt: the frozen clock, the lone tree, the small house. Every symbol I had struggled to understand suddenly made sense. We sat cross-legged on the floor, pieces of the past scattered around us, the sunlight warm on our shoulders. Mara traced her finger along a line in the photograph, as if confirming the memory stitched in her quilt. Her lips moved silently, humming to the rhythm of the story. I realized then that the quilt was more than a record. It was a guide, a living map that had led us here, into the heart of forgotten lives. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the archives themselves were holding their breath. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the faint rustle of paper sounded like whispering voices. I felt a tug in my chest, a mixture of sorrow and awe, understanding that some stories are so fragile they can only survive stitched into fabric or inked on a yellowed page. Mara looked up at me, eyes steady, silent, certain. I nodded, feeling the weight of the years pressing on us both. The quilt had led us here, and now it was asking something of me, not just to see, but to carry forward the memory that had been hidden for so long. I stood slowly, brushing dust from my knees, and took one last look at the photograph. The sunlight fell across it at just the right angle, illuminating her face, frozen in youth, unforgotten at last. Mara held the quilt tightly to her chest, small hands clutching the fabric, as if holding a heartbeat. I realized the past was no longer buried. It was speaking, stitch by stitch, waiting for us to follow. And as we left the archives, the quiet streets of town seemed different, heavier with the weight of what had been lost, but lighter too, alive with the possibility of remembering. The pantry door had always been ordinary, just a wooden panel with a faded brass handle. But that morning, the quilt guided Mara's small hand toward it. She pressed against the edge, and the door shuddered as if awakening from a long sleep. Dust motes stirred in the sunlight, falling like tiny sparks across the floor. I held my breath, feeling the weight of the quiet house settle into anticipation. The closet beyond was small, cold, and smelled of old cedar and winter. Shadows pooled along the walls, stretching long and dark, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for decades. Mara stepped inside carefully, the quilt folded over her arms like a talisman, and I followed, every floorboard groaning beneath my careful steps. Boxes and crates leaned against the walls, tightly packed, as if the room had been sealed to protect what lay inside. I ran my fingers along the surfaces, the rough wood pressing into my palms. Letters tied with string, objects wrapped in yellowed tissue, and a diary with a cracked spine stared back at me. The air felt heavier here, full of unspoken stories. Memories pressed flat against the ceiling. Mara knelt and began to pull objects from the crates, small hands careful, deliberate. I watched as she opened the diary, pages brittle, and read softly, her lips barely moving. The letters revealed fragments of a life hidden from everyone, the quiet story of my aunt, the missing year, the secrets stuck into corners of our family home. My chest ached. Each detail the quilt had stitched was now tangible, written in ink and worn paper. I found an envelope with my name on it, scrawled in handwriting I recognized from a photograph long ago. Inside were letters I had never seen, carefully folded, bearing witness to a year erased. The pieces fell together: the frozen clock, the small house, the tree, and the patchwork. Mara's quilt had been a map, a guide, showing us where the hidden life had lingered all along. We sat among the boxes, the light slanting through the small window, catching the dust in shimmering streaks. Mara traced the letters with her fingertips, and I felt the pulse of the past in the air, alive and insistent. The house seemed to exhale slowly, relieved, as if it had finally released a long-held breath. I realized then that the hidden room wasn't just a place. It was a vessel, a container for the things people had tried to forget. And Mara, with her small hands in the quilt, had been the key, the bridge between the silence and the story. The quiet was profound, sacred. Outside, a branch scraped lightly against the window, a soft reminder that the world had not stopped while this room held its secrets. Mara folded the quilt around her again, and I felt the weight of generations in the small bundle of fabric. As we left the hidden room, carrying the diary and letters carefully, I understood that some truths must be uncovered slowly, piece by piece. The quilt had led us here, yes, but it had also taught me something deeper, that the past is always alive, waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard, if you are willing to listen. And as we closed the pantry door behind us, the house seemed to settle into a quiet I had never known before, full, watchful, and waiting for what came next. The house felt different that evening, heavier and yet quieter. Shadows lingered in corners as if waiting for me to speak the words I had avoided for decades. Mara sat on the floor, quilt across her knees, eyes downcast but steady. The letters and diary from the hidden room lay spread before us, like a fragile map of a life we had never acknowledged. I held one of the letters carefully, feeling the roughness of the paper beneath my fingers. The handwriting was familiar, deliberate, full of care that had been ignored for too long. Each line was a memory, a secret whispered through ink. I read silently, the words pressing against my chest. The missing year, my aunt's disappearance, the things no one wanted to speak aloud, they were here now, unavoidable. Mara looked up at me, small and quiet, and nodded. She didn't need to speak. Her quilt had already told me everything I needed to understand. But understanding was not the same as facing it. I walked slowly through the living room, letters in hand, imagining the conversations I had never had, the questions I had never asked. The house seemed to pulse with the weight of all that silence. I found myself standing before my own reflection. In the hallway mirror, the face staring back was older, yes, but also unprepared. Unprepared for the truth that the quilt and Mara had unearthed. My hands shook slightly as I folded one of the letters, the weight of decades pressing into my fingers. I realized that silence had been easier than truth, but it had come at a cost. Mara rose, holding the quilt close to her chest. She placed her small hand over mine, steadying me. "It's okay," she whispered softly. "No more explanation." The quilt, the letters, the shadows, they had all been guiding us toward this moment. To face what had been hidden, to name it, to breathe it aloud finally. We began to speak quietly, softly, words breaking the heavy air. My aunt's name, the missing year, The choices made in fear or shame, all of it floated between us, delicate and fragile. The house held our words, absorbing them, letting them settle slowly into its beams. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches, and I felt that same wind in my chest, lifting some weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I traced the quilt stitches with my fingers, letting the shapes, the small house, the lone tree, the frozen clock ground me. Mara watched, silent, but her eyes held the quiet understanding that only children seem to possess, the ability to hold a story, even a painful one, without being consumed by it. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of the silence begin to lift. Not fully, not entirely, but enough to breathe, enough to start untangling the threads that had bound our family in quiet shame. The quilt had led us here, and now the truth had a voice. As night fell, the letters tucked safely back in their envelope, Mara and I sat together, the quilt warm between us. The house exhaled slowly, and I realized that confronting silence is not about shattering it all at once. It's about letting it unfold gently, stitch by stitch, word by word. And in that gentle unfolding, I knew the story had only just begun. The afternoon sunlight fell in gentle, warm slants across the floorboards, catching the quilt in Mara's lap and turning each thread into a soft, glowing line. I sat beside her, knees brushing, careful not to disturb the delicate work she had carried through so many nights. Each stitch felt alive, like a pulse beneath my fingertips, a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo through the house. We didn't speak at first. The silence was full, comfortable, the kind that comes after truths have been spoken but before they have fully settled. Mara traced the patterns with her fingers, her small hand moving slowly, reverently. I watched the shapes she had stitched, the small house, the frozen clock, the tree, and for the first time, I saw them not as symbols of fear or mystery, but as markers of understanding. Her eyes met mine briefly, steady and unflinching. "It's all connected," she whispered. "Everything I stitched. It's all part of what happened." The words were simple, but the weight in them was immense. I nodded, letting the quilt rest between us like a bridge spanning the past and present. The house seemed to breathe with us, the walls absorbing our quiet realization. I picked up a square of the patchwork and traced the tiny letters with my fingers. Names, dates, images of people who had been erased or forgotten, they were all here, stitched carefully into the fabric. I realized the quilt wasn't just a map of a hidden year. It was a record of courage, a testament to lives that had been overlooked, waiting patiently for someone to notice. Mara hummed softly, a melody that felt like a heartbeat beneath the threads. I felt my own chest loosen, a weight I hadn't known I was carrying slowly lifting. Understanding doesn't erase pain. It doesn't undo loss, but it allows memory to breathe, to exist without fear. And in that quiet afternoon, with the sunlight warm on our shoulders, I began to understand the depth of what we had uncovered. The house remained still, the wind outside tapping lightly against the windows. I traced the quilt's shapes again, the stitches guiding my fingers like Mara had guided my heart. Every line held intention, every loop of thread a deliberate act of remembrance. I felt a connection not just to Mara, but to the generations who had been silenced, whose stories now lived again in fabric and memory. We sat together for a long time, letting the quilt tell its story without interruption. I realized that understanding is not always spoken aloud. Sometimes it is felt in the quiet, in the careful tracing of lines, in the gentle press of a small hand on your own. Mara's quilt had taught me this. It had shown me that stories survive, stitched patiently, waiting for someone to see them. As the light shifted, brushing the edges of the room with gold, Mara folded the quilt in her lap and rested her head against my shoulder. The house exhaled, and I understood fully that some truths are carried in threads, some memories in silence. And in this quiet, I finally felt the first fragile piece of knowing what had been hidden and of understanding it together. The night had settled deep around the farmhouse, thick and quiet, with only the occasional scrape of a branch against the window. Mara sat on the edge of her bed, the quilt spread across her lap, the patterns glowing softly in the dim lamplight. Every stitch pulsed with memory, every line carrying a fragment of a story we had only just begun to understand. I sat beside her, careful not to disturb the rhythm she had created. The air was still, heavy with the weight of decades, yet it felt alive, almost listening. The quilt had spoken through her hands, through symbols and shapes, through the silent insistence of a child who knew more than she could say. And now, in this room, the story was complete, or at least, complete enough to let us breathe. Mara's small fingers traced the lines of thread with reverence, her eyes steady, unafraid. "It remembers," she whispered. "Everything." I nodded, trying to take in the enormity of what she meant. The quilt had not only told us the story of the missing year, of my aunt, of the lives tucked away in corners and closets. It had given those stories a voice. I reached out, letting my fingers hover over the stitches, almost afraid to touch them. Each line felt sacred, alive with intention. The small house, the lone tree, the frozen clock, all of it was more than memory. It was connection. It was understanding. It was love threaded into fabric, carefully, patiently, so that even silence could not erase it. Outside, the wind whispered against the eaves. The house exhaled slowly, a long, gentle sigh, as though it too had been holding its breath for decades. Mara leaned her head against my shoulder, the quilt warm between us, and I realized something profound. The past was no longer gone. It was here, stitched into our hands, into our hearts, into the quiet walls of this house. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The quilt had said everything, its voice soft but insistent, a pulse beneath our fingertips. I felt tears slip silently down my cheeks, not from sorrow, not entirely, but from the recognition of all we had carried and all we had uncovered. I traced the edges of the patchwork slowly, memorizing the shapes, the lines, the tiny letters. Each stitch was a heartbeat, each loop a whisper. Mara hummed quietly, a lullaby that seemed to settle the house itself. I felt the weight of the hidden year lift slightly, replaced by something gentler, something like understanding, and then I realized the quilt was not finished with us. Its story had been spoken, yes, but it had also planted questions, seeds of reflection that would follow us for years. Some stories do not, and they ripple outward, quietly, like wind over the fields, touching everything it passes. The lamplight softened, the shadows stretching long across the floor. Mara rested against me, her breathing even and calm. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quilt speak one final time, not through words, but through memory, through presence, through the delicate rhythm of stitched lines. In that silence, I knew we were connected not just to the past, but to each other, to the house, to the hidden lives that had finally been remembered. The quilt had spoken, and for the first time, I felt the quiet, full weight of a story set free.